welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are bringing you an exploration into the the psychological and structural driver behind almost every major global conflict dominating the news cycle right now.
Yeah, we're really looking past the daily headlines today to figure out the deeper why behind the behavior of great powers.
Exactly. The mission here is to decode the invisible fears that push nations toward conflict. And to do that, we're relying on an incredibly insightful piece of geopolitical analysis called the Geopolitics of Encirclement. Fear and power in global strategy.
Right, but before we jump into the mechanics of that source, we really need to establish the ground rules for this discussion.
Oh, definitely. That is super important.
Because the analysis we're unpacking today, it touches on highly charged ongoing global events. I mean, we're talking about the war in Ukraine, NATO expansion, the really intense competition between the United States and China.
Very sensitive, very current issues.
Exactly, and because these are incredibly sensitive and ongoing issues, we want to be perfectly clear with you, the listener. We are not taking any sides today.
No sides at all.
Our goal is strictly to impartially report the analytical perspectives contained in the source material. You know, we're just here to understand the perceptions that drive nations without endorsing any specific geopolitical narrative or justifying any action.
Right. We're just looking at the board. And the thesis we are looking at today argues that nations rarely go to war over a single, isolated event. I mean, they go to war when they feel strategically cornered.
Yeah.
So to understand how that feels on a national scale, I want you to imagine you are stepping into a large, empty elevator. You press your floor, the doors are about to close, and the last second, someone else walks in.
Okay, I can picture it.
Now, they have the whole elevator to stand in, right?
Yeah.
But they choose to stand exactly 1 inch away from you, just hovering right off your shoulder.
That is incredibly uncomfortable.
Right. Even if they don't say a single word, even if they aren't actively throwing a punch, your heart rate spikes. Your brain immediately registers an emergency. You feel physically cornered.
And that spatial violation, it triggers a profound, almost primal alarm system in the human brain. We hate feeling boxed in.
We really do.
And what the source does is take that exact suffocating feeling of being trapped in an elevator and scales it up to the size of the entire globe. From Washington to Beijing to New Delhi, the world's great powers are feeling increasingly claustrophobic.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
Because to really grasp why modern conflicts unfold the way they do, we first have to understand why physical borders, like actual dirt, water, and mountains, still dictate global politics in an era of digital globalization.
Yeah, you'd think the internet changed all that, but it really didn't.
Exactly. It comes down to something called strategic space. Think of strategic space as a nation's room to maneuver militarily, economically, and geographically.
Right.
No powerful state wants hostile forces positioned right next to its core territories or rival powers controlling its critical trade routes.
And you see this pattern repeating across all of human history. I mean, the Roman Empire constantly fought to establish buffer zones around its periphery. They were always pushing tribal threats as far from Rome as possible.
Keep them at arm's length.
Exactly. Or look at Imperial Britain. They maintain overwhelming maritime supremacy to keep potential invaders far, far away from the English Channel. Because geography is completely unforgiving.
Yeah.
If your nation sits on very flat terrain and heavily armed rivals are allowed close to your industrial heartlands, you are inherently vulnerable. And this vulnerability creates the demand for strategic depth.
Strategic depth. Right.
Yeah, which is basically the physical distance between enemy power and a nation's core.
So bringing it back to that elevator analogy, think of strategic depth like your own personal space bubble in that elevator.
Yeah.
If someone is standing 50 feet away across a parking lot, you have plenty of reaction time if they decide to rush you.
Because that distance is your buffer.
Exactly. But if they're standing 1 inch from your nose, your brain registers an immediate threat because your reaction time is essentially zero. You have no depth.
And historically, the countries that survive massive invasions are the ones with the most strategic depth. The source highlights Russia as the ultimate historical case study for this concept.
Oh yeah, the classic land war in Asia.
Right. When Napoleon invaded Russia in 1812, and then when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, the Russian military didn't just win through superior battlefield tactics.
They didn't have to.
No, they didn't. They weaponized their massive territorial depth to absorb the shock of the invasion. They forced the invading armies to stretch their supply lines over thousands of miles.
Wow.
And by the time Napoleon's horse-drawn carriages forces or Hitler's mechanized units actually reached the Russian core, the sheer distance had exhausted their logistics. And of course, the brutal winter amplified the attrition.
They essentially traded space for time. They just let the geography do the fighting.
Precisely. And over centuries, surviving those catastrophic invasions produced a very ingrained strategic culture within Russia. The absolute core rule of their geopolitics became this: never allow hostile powers too close to the Russian heartland.
You have to maintain that physical buffer at all costs.
At all costs.
So taking that historical desperation for a physical buffer, that brings us right to the doorstep of the modern conflict in Ukraine.
It does.
The psychological need for distance triggered a massive collision of perceptions.
And the source explains this collision through a concept known as the security dilemma. Honestly, this is arguably the central tragedy of international relations.
The central tragedy.
Yeah, because the security dilemma happens when one state takes actions to strengthen itself defensively. So like building a fort, signing a treaty, expanding an alliance.
Basic self-defense stuff.
Right. But the state next door looks at those exact same actions and interprets them as offensive preparations.
Oh, I say, like, why are you building a fort unless you're planning to attack me?
Exactly. So the second state responds by building up its own military, which then validates the first state's initial fears, causing them to escalate further.
It's a vicious cycle.
It is. Both sides genuinely believe they are acting purely defensively, yet the cycle inevitably spirals toward instability.
And you can map this dynamic perfectly onto Ukraine. You have two completely different security visions occupying the exact same geographic space.
Very different visions.
Yeah, from the perspective of NATO and Western countries, expanding eastward after the Cold War was viewed as voluntary integration. It was seen as a stabilizing force for Eastern Europe.
Right, because countries that had spent decades under Soviet domination actively sought out that protection and economic integration.
Exactly. The Western perspective emphasizes that sovereign nations have the inherent right to choose their own alliances and their own security arrangements.
But wait, looking at this purely analytically, doesn't a sovereign nation like Ukraine have that right? I mean, if the citizens of a country want to join an economic or military bloc, how does a geopolitical strategist factor in sovereign choice when looking at a map?
Well, what's fascinating here is geopolitics rarely functions through the lens of domestic morality or one-sided perceptions. A strategist analyzes the map by assuming the absolute worst-case scenario.
Okay.
While the West viewed eastward expansion as a voluntary democratic process, Russia interpreted that exact same expansion as the steady erosion of its critical buffer zone.
Right, they see the space shrinking.
Yeah. They perceived Ukraine not just as an independent neighbor making a choice, but as a potential forward operating platform for Western military influence.
That space bubble shrinking again, the person in the elevator taking a deliberate step closer.
And the source makes a crucial point about the psychology of national power here. The fear of future weakness is often far more destabilizing than present weakness.
Future weakness.
Yeah. Once leaders begin to believe their strategic options are permanently shrinking, that the geopolitical clock is basically ticking against them, they often act aggressively to stop that clock.
Because the fear is that waiting will just allow the balance of power to become irreversibly worse.
It's not always driven by a grand desire to conquer. Sometimes it's just the terror of being permanently cornered.
Wow.
And, we've been talking about vast plains and land borders, but that anxiety of being boxed in isn't limited to dry land. The exact same psychological panic applies to the ocean.
Oh, absolutely. Let's look at the vulnerabilities facing China. Unlike Russia's continental anxieties, China's deepest fears are heavily connected to maritime geography.
Because modern China is this industrial and economic juggernaut.
Right. But that massive economy depends almost entirely on global maritime trade. Energy imports from the Middle East, raw materials from Africa, industrial exports to Europe and the Americas, they all flow through incredibly vulnerable maritime corridors.
Like choke points.
Exactly. A huge percentage of China's oil imports has to pass through the Strait of Malacca, which is a really narrow waterway between Malaysia and Indonesia.
Meaning, if a rival naval power suddenly decides to blockade that single strait, the entire Chinese economy could grind to a halt. I mean, they would run out of energy.
And Chinese strategists study this vulnerability obsessively. They look at the map and see what military analysts call the first island chain.
The first island chain.
Yeah, it's a geographic string of islands stretching from Japan down through Taiwan and into the Philippines. And from Beijing's perspective, this geography acts as a potential physical wall that could easily constrain their navy from reaching the wider open waters of the Pacific Ocean.
And it's not just the physical islands that worry them, it's the military alliances forming around those islands.
Oh, definitely.
You look at the news and you see the Quad. And for anyone unfamiliar, that's a strategic security dialogue between the United States, India, Japan, and Australia. 4 massive democracies spanning the Indo-Pacific coordinating naval exercises.
Right.
Then you have AUKUS, which is a major security partnership where the US and the UK are helping Australia acquire nuclear-powered submarines, plus expanding US defense ties with Japan and the Philippines.
And from Washington's perspective, these are all framed as defensive partnerships to ensure a free and open Indo-Pacific trade route. But how does Beijing view that same map?
They see a fence being systematically built around their front yard.
Exactly. They perceive a coordinated pattern of military containment. So to prevent being strategically trapped near its own coastline, China has aggressively modernized its navy.
Building ships like crazy.
Yeah, they are building aircraft carriers, advanced destroyers, and literally constructing artificial islands in the South China Sea to serve as military outposts. All of it serves one broader strategic objective: push the perimeter out to prevent maritime confinement.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. The source points out that China isn't just relying on ships to break out of this perceived trap. The Belt and Road Initiative, which is usually reported on as a massive trillion-dollar global economic development project, is actually a geopolitical escape hatch.
Oh, that's a great way to put it. Think about the mechanics of the Belt and Road. If you are terrified that your rivals might use their navies to blockade your sea routes, the logical response is to build alternative trade corridors overland.
Right. You fund a deep water port in Gwadar, Pakistan, and you build a pipeline running straight up through the mountains into western China. Suddenly, a massive portion of your energy supply bypasses the Malacca Strait entirely.
Completely bypasses the choke point.
You build high-speed rail links through Central Asia straight into Europe. The Belt and Road Initiative isn't just about making money. It's a way to survive a potential maritime siege by ensuring your supply lines can't be cut off by a foreign navy.
Because great powers are absolutely terrified of dependency on systems controlled by their rivals. If your national survival relies on a trade route heavily monitored by a competing power, you are not truly a secure state. You are perpetually vulnerable.
And for a while, especially in the decade or two following the Cold War, there was a widespread belief that globalization was going to make all this great power rivalry obsolete.
Right, the end of history.
Yeah, the theory was that if everyone trades with everyone and our supply chains are completely intertwined, nobody will ever risk a major conflict because it would just bankrupt them.
It was a very optimistic theory. But geopolitics simply adapted to the new reality. Yeah. Economic interdependence didn't eliminate national vulnerabilities. It actually weaponized them.
Weaponized them. Wow.
Encirclement doesn't just happen with tanks and battleships anymore. It happens invisibly through economic and technological networks without a single shot ever being fired.
So we are basically seeing the return of classical power politics, but the battlegrounds have shifted. The new strategic choke points aren't just narrow straits of water. They are semiconductors, artificial intelligence ecosystems, and rare earth minerals.
Consider the mechanics of a modern tech embargo. The supply chain for advanced microchips is incredibly complex. You have the intellectual design largely based in the United States, the physical manufacturing dominated by facilities in Taiwan, and the highly specialized lithography machines required to print the chips built by a single company in the Netherlands.
It's totally globally distributed.
Exactly. So if one global power can coordinate those different nodes to cut off a rival's access to advanced chips, they can effectively stall that rival's artificial intelligence development, their advanced military systems, and their consumer electronics.
So what does this all mean? It's like being under siege in the medieval days, but instead of an enemy army surrounding your castle and starving you out by cutting off your water supply, they're cutting off your microchips.
Yes.
They're severing your access to the global financial system.
And the realization that economic dependence can instantly be turned into geopolitical coercion has completely rewritten global strategy. Countries are now desperately scrambling for technological sovereignty and secure domestic supply chains.
Because they realize they can be strategically contained through an embargo just as effectively as through a naval blockade.
Exactly. And this is creating a massive triangular tension that is defining our current era.
Break down that triangle for us.
Okay, so you have the United States, which fears losing its strategic primacy and the international order it spent decades building. You have China, which fears maritime and technological containment as its power grows. And you have Russia, which fears absolute strategic isolation and the loss of its geographic buffers.
That's a lot of fear.
It is. And caught in the middle of these three overlapping anxieties are the middle powers, the emerging economies who are terrified of being forced to pick a side and getting crushed in the gears of this competition.
So if you're a massive rising power looking at this incredibly dangerous map-seeing superpowers lock horns over trade routes, microchips, and borders, how do you avoid getting caught in the crossfire? Look at how India is handling this landscape.
India is a fascinating case study. They occupy a uniquely difficult position in this changing order. While other nations are being pulled into rigid strategic blocks, India is fiercely pursuing a strategy of strategic autonomy.
Strategic autonomy.
Yeah, they refuse to be locked into a formal military alliance with anyone.
Because they're trying to balance multiple massive pressures simultaneously. Let's look at their geography. To their north, they have a highly contested, militarized Himalayan frontier with China. To their west, they have Pakistan.
That is their continental defense problem.
Right. But to their south, they have the entire Indian Ocean, one of the most critical strategic waterways on the planet, carrying all the energy and trade that fuels their massive economic growth.
So they have to secure the mountains and project power across the sea at the exact same time.
But can a country really play all sides forever? I mean, doesn't trying to be everyone's partner eventually leave you totally isolated when a real crisis hits?
Yeah.
If you don't commit to an alliance, who comes to help you when things get bad?
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to realize that for India, this balancing act isn't just a diplomatic preference. It is a geographic necessity.
A necessity.
Yeah. Narrow, rigid thinking would completely doom a country with India's complex borders. They cannot afford to completely alienate Russia, which is a major legacy supplier of their military hardware, because pushing Russia away would just drive Moscow closer to Beijing, which intensifies India's continental threat.
Oh, that makes sense.
But they also can't afford to ignore the maritime domain.
So they cooperate with the United States and the Quad in the Indo-Pacific to balance those maritime pressures, while simultaneously maintaining those legacy defense and energy relations with Russia to ensure continental stability.
Exactly. In a fragmented, highly volatile world, the source argues that flexibility is actual power. India's ability to preserve independent decision-making might just be its greatest strategic strength.
Because if you aren't locked into a block, you can't easily be encircled by an opposing block.
Right, you remain fluid and adaptable.
But adapting requires rational decision-making. And as we map out this physical board of land, sea, and supply chains, we really have to remember the players moving the pieces are human beings.
Always.
There's a massive psychological element driving everything we've discussed today. Great powers behave psychologically.
They absolutely do. Historical memory dictates national behavior just as much as economic data or military metrics do.
And the source lists out these historical traumas, and it is fascinating when you view current events through this lens. Russia's behavior is driven by the deep generational memory of catastrophic invasions from the West.
Right, Napoleon, Hitler.
China's entire modern strategy is fueled by the memory of what they call the century of humiliation. For context, this was a period roughly from the mid-19th to the mid-20th century, where China was repeatedly subjugated, invaded, and forced into unequal treaties by Western powers and Japan.
Which leaves a deep scar.
Huge. When you understand that history, you understand why foreign navies operating near their coastline today trigger such a visceral defensive reaction. Meanwhile, the United States is driven by the memory of its post-World War II role, fueled by the belief that global stability relies fundamentally on American leadership and deterrence.
See, these aren't just history lessons to be read in a textbook. They are living national narratives. When a leader believes their nation is being strategically cornered, those historical memories merge with modern geopolitics.
And that is incredibly dangerous for everyone listening. It's one thing to have a disagreement over a border demarcation or a dispute over solar panel tariffs. You can negotiate numbers. But when national pride, civilizational identity, and unhealed historical trauma are pulling the strings, compromise suddenly looks like submission. Domestically, no leader can afford to look weak. They can't back down without losing their political mandate.
This raises an important question. How does a system like this avoid disaster? In an environment where multiple great powers possess nuclear weapons, this mutual strategic paranoia systematically destroys all trust.
You just assume everyone is out to get you.
You begin to assume the absolute worst of your rival's intentions. The source warns that the most dangerous escalation pathway we face today isn't pure, unprovoked aggression like we saw in the mid-20th century.
It's not just a land grab.
No, it is miscalculation. It is a crisis spiraling out of control because both sides act preemptively out of fear.
Fear of the person stepping closer in the elevator.
Exactly.
When every new defense treaty is viewed as a cage being built, and every new technology is viewed as an invisible weapon, the global system grows incredibly unstable.
And the ultimate takeaway from the source material is that the future of global power won't just belong to the nation with the biggest military budget or the most aircraft carriers.
What will it belong to?
It will belong to the state that maintains the most resilience and adaptability across all domains. The state that can survive sudden supply chain shocks, secure its technological infrastructure, and stay flexible without giving into the paranoia that leads to catastrophic war.
And for you, listening to this right now, being armed with this concept of strategic encirclement completely changes how you consume information. You can now decode the daily news.
It really is a lens.
Tomorrow, when you read a headline about a new tariff on electric vehicles, a sudden naval drill in the Pacific, or a new restriction on microchip manufacturing, you will understand the invisible structural fears driving those actions. You are seeing the geopolitical space bubble expanding and contracting in real time.
You're seeing the invisible walls of that elevator we talked about.
Exactly. But I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, something that builds on the source's mention of artificial intelligence and this deep human psychology we've been discussing, but takes it one step into uncharted territory.
Okay.
If the greatest threat to global stability right now is human paranoia, the visceral, sweaty fear of being encircled, what happens when artificial intelligence systems are put in charge of national security threat assessments?
Oh, wow.
Because militaries around the world are already moving in that direction. If a supercomputing algorithm is trained to detect early signs of geopolitical containment, will its hyper-calculated paranoia accidentally trigger the exact same security dilemma we've been trying to avoid?
That is terrifying.
When a machine detects the geopolitical equivalent of someone standing 1 inch away in that elevator, how fast does it punch back?
A chilling thought to end on.
Keep an eye on your space bubble, folks. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Thank you for joining us on this Strategic Vanguard podcast. If you found value in this analysis, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. We bring you fresh podcasts every Monday here on YouTube and Rumble, and you can also catch the audio versions on Spotify and Amazon Music. Just search for Strategic Vanguard Podcast. For more insights, articles, and discussions, subscribe to our blog at strategicvanguard.com. Your support helps us grow and bring you more in-depth analysis on defense, geopolitics, and strategy. Until next time, stay informed, stay strategic.